joining us for the RBST Biosecurity Summary. At today's guests, we have Claire Scott and Jesus Gallego, and also we have Tracy Watson-Jones, also from RBST with us. So Jesus, if you want to just kick us off with a brief introduction, and then Claire, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. I'm Jesus Gallego. I'm Deputy Chief Vet in the Animal Health and Welfare Division of the Scottish Government.
Hi, I'm Claire. I lead the pig expert group for APHA, where we seek to protect against new pig disease-related threats through intelligence gathering, threat characterisation, and then information sharing.
I wanted to ask, first of all, Claire, are you able to give us your definition of what is biosecurity?
Yes, very happy to. So biosecurity really refers to this set of management actions and measures and precautions which are designed to reduce the risk of introduction, establishment and spread of harmful organisms. So in farming, we're normally thinking about this in terms of spread between and within holdings, but I think it's also important to consider the wider level here. So we can also think about the prevention of exotic pathogens to GB or the UK reaching our shores. And I think we also need to think about potential implications on human health. So thinking about the diseases that could be passed on to humans from animals or vice versa through direct contact normally. And also if the animal is going to be slaughtered for human consumption, we also need to think about diseases that could be passed on through food.
Fantastic, thank you. And Jesus, in your line of work, are there any common misconceptions that you come across with biosecurity in Scotland?
Yes, I think there are. I think first is that people don't always understand what we mean by biosecurity. And as Claire has explained, really biosecurity doesn't have to be complicated. It's about disease prevention. It's about eliminating or trying to reduce the opportunities for diseases to enter, whether it is a farm or an entire population or an entire country, depending on what it is your area of work.
Mm-hmm.
It's generally anything that you can do to reduce your own risk. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It's not necessarily, although obviously in the line of work of government, we tend to be concerned about notifiable diseases, etc. The measures are quite often common to all diseases, and anything you do to prevent foot and mouth disease or avian influenza is also going to help you with your production diseases and with your economically significant diseases that will be more of a direct concern to farmers than the maybe apparently remote risk of getting foot and mouth disease, for example.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we think that's really important as well, because like you say, good biosecurity is the emphasis of important, simple daily habits that really can make such a difference in the long run. Thank you both for that. We're just going to move on to why biosecurity matters, and I'm going to pass you on to Tracy for this one.
You've done a really good summary there of what biosecurity is. But for the both of you, why do you think it matters? What are the implications of not having good biosecurity?
Well, it matters because poor biosecurity is a risk to the individual farm, but second, it's a risk to the whole industry. The industry is only as safe as the weakest point, and if disease whether it is the country or the industry or the individual farm, once it's there, it can spread much more easily than if we keep it outside to start with. And it's important not only for the greater good of the farming community and the industry, etc. It is important to the farmers themselves. And for production diseases in particular, you have a huge hidden cost from loss of production that is just not apparent, but which, generally speaking, prevention always is better than cure. And economically, it will be more cost effective to prevent disease than to treat it.
Thank you. And Claire, have you got anything to add to that?
Really just to echo what Jesus has said. So, the kind of worst case scenarios being potential introduction of exotic notifiable disease, but which would be hugely potentially damaging to trade, to these whole livestock sectors. But then at the less severe end of the scale, some of these diseases that are already present in the UK on some holdings, but not all holdings, can have some really devastating effects. So I come at this from the pig angle. So swine dysentery is one disease that we're concerned about at the moment and believe it to be spreading due to suboptimal biosecurity. And that disease can actually be really severe in naive pigs, and you can end up losing some rare bloodlines through that, and is also a nightmare to eradicate from the holding. So to kind of put what Jesus was saying into kind of real disease example, it's much better to prevent this disease than then have to deal with it. And we very sadly quite often come across part of my work includes sometimes diagnosing these endemic diseases on holdings. Quite often after we make a diagnosis for a holding, we see them want to massively tighten up biosecurity, which is obviously great to then prevent further diseases, but for that particular disease it's too late by that point. And even things like the introduction of lice onto a holding can lead to really severe welfare issues from having really itchy pigs, medicine use from needing to inject these animals with anthelmintic every few months just to keep on top of the issue. And yeah, so the more we can prevent these, the better, I think. And I guess I'd just touch on an attitude that I came across not exclusively during my PhD. So my PhD was looking at disease management on small holdings. And I occasionally came across this idea that smallholders want to have a bit of a laissez-faire attitude to biosecurity because they see that as a more natural approach to kind of have farm animals be exposed to diseases as we are naturally exposed to diseases as we go out and about. But I guess what I would say to kind of caution that approach is that we're quite different from farm animals in that, our kids are going to school, we're going to work, we're constantly mixing about with people, we are constantly being exposed to pathogens. But actually a holding can be quite a stable environment in terms of the microorganisms that are circulating around. And actually to have this really sudden introduction of a pathogen is actually quite unnatural and then can lead to all these repercussions. So and lead to medicine use and farm animal keepers needing to then adopt practices that they didn't want to have to adopt. So I think prevention being better than cure being a common mantra here.
That's great, thank you. And I guess from RBST's point of view, in terms of our rare livestock breeds, we're talking about sort of small populations, unique genetics, sort of bloodlines that are irreplaceable. And Claire, you sort of mentioned that. So last week or the week before, the government brought out a new MBS list where they categorise in their way slightly differently to our watch list about which breeds are classed as sort of in danger because of their small populations, their small numbers. Could both of you speak a little bit about how good biosecurity can benefit some of these smaller populations of our rare livestock?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think obviously many diseases of livestock can be devastating and have high impact on mortality or even on fertility and reproductive problems. Obviously, when you're talking about breeds with a very small population to start with, that impact is going to be much larger. If you have one of those devastating diseases, whether it is a notifiable disease or not, and it wipes out entire bloodlines, for example, you're going to have a much bigger problem than if we're talking about a commercial continental breed of which there are a wide range of genetic lines that can repopulate. So it's probably a bigger concern, the smaller the initial population, how much of an impact disease can going to have, and therefore the importance of disease prevention is probably higher for those that are critical to the survival of the breed.
I think it can also mean that different practices are required, and therefore potentially the biosecurity measures can need to be adapted. And that's where hopefully a good relationship with a vet comes in to be able to discuss these issues together. Because, if you, again, I'm going to come from a pig perspective, but let's say you're trying to maintain a bloodline for which you can't get for which you use artificial insemination for, because perhaps that's not available at a boar stud, and therefore you need to be moving animals on to the holding. which could then infer a risk of disease. That's a balancing act, really, isn't it? Because you've decided, okay, I want to maintain this rare breed or this rare bloodline, but that means that I need to bring animals on. So that's about sitting down with your vet or trusted advisors, looking at all the information that's available online, but applying that to your specific holding and the practices that you feel you need to perform, but doing that in a way that is less risky or kind of mitigates those risks. So, for example, having an isolation facility that you use really robustly to reduce those risks of bringing on new animals.
And I guess another sort of aspect to this, we've spoken a bit about sort of at farm level, but maybe you can expand a little on this national disease control level. So what can we do, or what can we feed into as sort of farmers and smallholders into the sort of national picture?
When we're talking about rare breeds, you can have very different settings depending on which species and which breed we're talking about, and some are rarer than others, some are better organized in terms of, for example, of societies, etc. It's one of those areas where you have to balance health and genetics because you have a very limited genetic pool. So again, as Claire has mentioned, that might affect the tools that are available to you, in that you're probably going to have some level of inevitable movements and contacts. It's the kind of the lifestyle of rare breeds also involves, for example, attending shows, etc. Because you keep these breeds, you want to showcase them and display them, and attending shows is a well-known biosecurity risk. So it doesn't mean that you don't want to do it. You just have to be aware of what the risks are and do it safely, and that place a responsibility on those keepers, also on show organizers, on how do they ensure that their guests, I guess, that are safe. They don't bring anything dangerous pathogens to the shows. They don't take any dangerous pathogens back home with them. At the end of the day, the whole point of these shows and exhibitions is to show the best of the breeds, not to spread disease to their target audience in the first place.
And Claire, you might be sort of better placed to answer this one, but in terms of because you did your PhD on smallholders, what are the differences sort of if you're dealing with very remote farms and sort of very remote small holdings, in terms of they might be further away from other sort of big populations or farming populations, but on the other hand, in terms of like knowledge sharing and learning from one another and that understanding of biosecurity, did you find much difference in that?
So I didn't specifically compare practices between more remote and less remote small holdings, but I think something that you can kind of pull out and of the literature and of my work is people think smallholders saying, well, actually I am really remote. I've not got any other farm animals anywhere near me, and I keep quite a closed system, and therefore I'm very low risk in terms of introduction of diseases, which I think is pretty fair enough. Yeah, in terms of knowledge sharing, one exercise that I asked my participants to do was to write down where they go to for kind of education and in terms of knowledge resources for disease management. Social media was a massive one, and actually a lot of these, because smallholders are really, as I'm sure you all know, smallholders are really busy people. They're often juggling the holding around their usual work. So actually the kind of resources that fit in around that tend to be often digital anyway. So and I think there are good resources out there. I think some resources are more tailored towards the commercial sector and therefore need some contextualization. But I don't think there needs to be a kind of big difference between the access that remote smallholders have compared to more city-based ones. And each holding will come with its own set of challenges. So, for example, if you're a visitor farm, then might need to come with different stipulations that you make to people attending the farm, or perhaps you have someone come around and scan your sheep and they're coming from holding to holding, and therefore you might need to have a chat to them about the kit they're bringing on. I think all these conversations are any holding specific, and rather than kind of making divides between particular types of holdings.
So, Jesus, I'm just wondering, are there any Scottish specific biosecurity rules that you feel like maybe smallholders or farmers don't know about or do not widely know?
Probably the main difference between Scotland and the rest of the UK in terms of biosecurity is we have slightly different rules on standstills, particularly on the duration of the standstill and the exceptions that apply. England and Wales have a short standstill with few exceptions. In Scotland, we have a longer standstill, other than for pigs. It's the same for pigs everywhere in GB, but for ruminants, it's longer in Scotland, but we have a wider number of exemptions that apply. For most other general biosecurity principles, there shouldn't be a significant difference. The difference will be on geography, climate, etc., which means that the risk that you need to concentrate about or worry about might be different. So if you're on the west coast of Scotland and it's wet, you're going to have to think about parasites, fasciola, etc. That will not so much if you're on the east side of the country, but that's the same in England. It's a geography and climate is not a different nation approach.
Well, I was just wondering whether it might be just a good idea maybe just to pop back to the visitor farm element briefly.
Absolutely, please do.
So yeah, I was just wondering if maybe we want to touch a bit more on, Jesus mentioned the significance. So looking at like a risk-based approach in terms of the likelihood of pathogens or diseases entering, and also the significance of those diseases. And I guess there it is really important to mention the need to follow legislation around ensuring that farm animals don't have access to products that have been food that has been through a human kitchen.
Yeah.
And really just to note that I think here visitor farms or visitor holdings can play quite a key role in terms of that education sharing that we were talking about earlier. So spreading the word on the legislation, say, that's currently in place around the EU-wide ban that's in place for personal imports of many animal products from ruminant and porcine origin, which was put in place following the incursions of foot-and-mouth disease in the EU during 2025. Actually, some signs up, say, to explain to visitors why they need to not be bringing these products back when they go on holiday, and two, perhaps they also have some chickens in the garden at home, and they might not be aware of the legislation around not feeding food that's been through a human kitchen, and obviously then the more basic steps for visitor farms of ensuring that the areas where people eat are far away from the areas that farm animals are kept, and ensuring that those kind of particularly risky areas in terms of very significant disease are really upheld.
Absolutely. I think signage and education to members of the public is so important. I mean, from my experience on my visitor farm, we had disinfectant masks, we had hand washing facilities, we had signs outside the lambing tunnels during lambing time about toxoplasmosis with pregnant women. Picnic areas were away from any livestock. And it's just having that education in place and really explaining, like you say, why this is in place and why it's so important as well.
Yeah, completely agree. I think sometimes people can look at the legislation and think, oh, this is, why am I having to do this? I've got chickens. Chickens are supposed to eat waste products or whatever. And explaining that actually, explaining the risk that would come with those practices, to hopefully people don't just see it as this kind of blanket ban, but see it as a thought out approach that is to protect our national herds and flocks.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
I think also talking about the sort of visitor farms, I think the other aspect of that, and what I was going to talk about, was shared grazing and commons, but also conservation grazing. So that's another big aspect where organisations and farms that are involved in conservation grazing have a lot of interaction with the public. and they're not so well designed perhaps in having, people just plonk down and have their picnic wherever, it's not quite that sort of nice segregation and having the hand washing and things that you would perhaps on a visitor farm. So would but you both like to say anything about shared grazing and sort of common land? Any experiences with that in terms of biosecurity?
Yeah, thanks. Common grazes are particularly important in Scotland in crofting areas. They're actually legally protected and defined, and they are very critical for crofters. It's one of those things that, from a biosecurity perspective, you need to bear in mind that it is a risk when you have animals of multiple origins under management on a single area. We just accept that it is part of the history of farming. But there are good stories as well on crofters working together for effective biosecurity. We just ran a very successful pilot on treatment of sheep scab in the Western Isles in the Isle of Harris, where farmers and crofters got together to deep sheep and test them and coordinate diagnostic and treatment for the benefit of all crofters and farmers there. So just because you run common land or you use common land doesn't mean that you cannot have effective biosecurity. It's just a very different way of managing biosecurity. You just have to coordinate with your neighbors and colleagues in the area. But obviously, there are challenges associated with gathering multiple origins in common land. You just have to live with it.
And I guess it's also important to note that if the worst were to happen, and I think pigs are a particular worry here, that perhaps a disease like African swine fever or foot and mouth disease could enter in pork meat products and then be disregarded, say, on common land for a feral or wild pig to then eat and then succumb to the disease. A lot of the trade implications, a lot of the implications for the sector are the same, no matter whether the disease were to enter a feral or wild pig or the kind of a domestic pig. So these considerations are so important for protecting our national herd, but as you rightly point out, are potentially harder to achieve when you've got huge areas and lots of different visitors who might not be as familiar with these concepts as perhaps a more contained setup.
And I think it's something that you mentioned earlier, Claire, about farmers and smallholders are really busy people, and I think they can sometimes see things like sort of movement records and quarantining. Sometimes the sort of farming calendar doesn't quite fit in with when you want to sort of purchase a ram or a bull. Might not sort of be sort of in a desperate hurry then to get them out doing their job and things like this. So what are your sort of top tips for getting farmers and smallholders to see that actually we all appreciate they're very busy, but these bits of legislation and essential things that they can do will actually save them a lot of time in the long run?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I quite frequently came across smallholders saying, "Oh, I had all the best intentions. I was going to isolate this animal, but then life got in the way and it didn't happen." And for me, that's about, as we've kind of said a few times, I guess, is in advance, preferably with your vet, sitting down and thinking, okay, what is our plan for this calendar year, and what can we do to protect our animals during this time, and having plans A, B, and C. We all know no initial plan survives contact. So having these chats around the dinner table with the family as well, and getting everyone involved in the process, having plans written down, and seeing this part as an investment in the future for the holding by keeping everyone safe, I'd say.
I think that's absolutely right. I think what I encourage farmers to do is think about biosecurity not as something you do for the benefits of others, for the benefit of the industry and for the benefit of the public, but for their own benefit, because it's not all about foot and mouth. It's all about the production diseases that can affect any farm at any time, and they might not be as high profile, but they probably have a much more cumulative impact on farm economics than foot and mouth might have once every 25 years.
And even for diseases that you already have on the holding, sometimes a different strain of a particular pathogen can be equally as devastating as a brand new introduction. So even if you think, oh, I've already got disease X, so I don't need to worry too much about preventing it. Well, you actually might have a kind of more mild strain, or your animals are used to that particular strain and therefore fairly resilient to it. But bringing on a whole new one could throw everything out of whack again and cause some serious problems. So yeah, being aware of what you have, but not using that as a reason not to worry.
We were going to talk next about wildlife and pests and feed security, rodent control, limiting contamination, etc. So Claire, should we touch on that? I mean, I'm particularly interested also in your work with pigs. How important is feed security, rodent control, etc., within pigs and pig farms, and all of the above?
Where pigs are being fed outdoors, that can be challenging. So yeah, basics of any feed storage, that absolutely should be completely rodent and wildlife proof. And then in terms of actual feeding, not feeding from the floor can be beneficial, but also can be expensive. So there are some really cool devices now, like even creep feeders, which allow the piglets access to feed, but not pests. But they are expensive. So I think again, it's about having that holding specific approach, thinking about what can be achieved feasibly, while still minimizing risks as far as possible. And then things like, if any dead wild birds are found, making sure that they are picked up promptly, obviously using gloves to minimize risks there. And yeah, smallholders are really busy, but they're also really interested and really enthusiastic. So I think keeping up to date with the kind of recommendations that are coming out of either APHA, so Farm Animal Diagnostic Service, tries to produce lots of recommendations based on the diseases that we diagnose. So we've diagnosed disease X quite a bit this year. What can you do about it on your holding? So keeping up with that kind of advice, and also just keeping up with the farming press to see what's topical at the moment and what you can be doing.
Absolutely. And Jesus, do you have anything to add to the wildlife and the pests?
Yeah, I think probably just to dispel the myth that because you cannot completely eliminate the risk from wildlife, there's nothing you can do. You should not kind of let the fact that you cannot eliminate the risk completely be the excuse for not trying. Because as Claire has said, there are many strategies depending on your farm and the type of species that you deal with that will reduce in some way the risk of disease spreading from wildlife. And of course, depending on your circumstances, you can apply more of those strategies or fewer of them, and you can invest more or less on feeding systems. But even if you don't do much, there's always something that you can do, for example, to discourage attracting wildlife through to the feed and to keep feed in a secure storage, etc. So there's always something that you can do that will reduce the risk and will be better than doing nothing.
Absolutely. So last question. We at RBST, we have very fortunately a lot of new entrants or younger farmers or even older farmers who decide to, get some land and then they will keep native and rare breeds, which is wonderful for us and obviously wonderful for the breeds as well. But if they are not from a agricultural background, I'm just wondering if both of you have any advice for people such as that about biosecurity, where they could get the information from, any top tips?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I think top one for me would be to start a relationship with a vet who understands what you are trying to do on your holding, and I would do this in advance of disease issues happening. because we know that when disease issues happen, it's a more stressful time, and actually you can find a vet trying to both solve a disease issue but also get to know the holding and understand what you want to achieve, which is really difficult. So doing that in advance, and together creating a farm animal health plan. So getting down on paper what you want to achieve, the kind of riskier areas for biosecurity, and what you can do to minimise or mitigate against some of those risks. And doing that collaboratively, because there's no point your vet kind of giving you a health plan and you say, oh, well, I can't do those things because of this reason. Well, your vet can't know that without you telling them. So working together to create that. But then, yeah, doing that whilst reading around topics, and yeah, I find smallholders are huge readers. So loads of advice on for pigs. It's things like AHDB, the British Pig Association, the National Pig Association, all release brilliant resources. Sometimes do need to be contextualised for a smallholding environment, but your vet can help you to do that. And I'd also say that it's a good idea to try to it's a good idea whenever you come across disease problems to involve your vet, even if they're just quite low level. Just keep them in the loop so that there's some notes on that, because you don't know what kind of alarm bells might ring in your vet's mind. So they might be able to, by keeping that conversation going, they might be able to build up a picture and think, oh, okay, actually it would be worth investigating this because these things together make me think perhaps there's a problem with this aspect. APHA can really support with that. So and also SOUC in Scotland. So there's the Farm Animal Diagnostic Services, which vets can speak to us about unusual cases and contact us for advice, and also can submit samples and also carcasses should the worst happen in these cases. So understanding what you have and thinking about what you want to do to reduce risk going forward.
I absolutely agree with Claire. I think having an ongoing relationship with the vet is critical for good health management. I think in the case of inexperienced keepers, general animal husbandry and farm management practice is also important. Equally, I'd encourage anybody wanting to keep livestock or other production animals without experience to learn about good husbandry and good farming practice. A lot of the problems we see are not necessarily health or disease problems, but they are management and nutrition and housing. We see that particularly with backyard chickens, which are easy to get hold of, not necessarily easy to keep if you don't know what you're doing. So learn about how to keep that particular species that you're keeping for the benefit of those animals and for the welfare.
Thank you both so very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. We understand how busy you both must be. So thank you both. We really, really appreciate it. And if there's obviously anything that RBST can do or help with, please do keep in touch. But that is absolutely brilliant. It was so lovely meeting you both as well.
Lovely to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.